welcome to the first session of the Bible study on Revelation. This is a recording after the fact. We had recorded in person, but when I went back to my phone to see the recorded video, only 3 minutes of that live session had been recorded. So I am recording this afterward to cover what we covered in person, and going forward, we intend to record in the session in the room so that you can see everyone, you online. So we started by asking everyone what kinds of things that we already know about Revelation. When we hear the book of Revelation, or when we hear someone mention it, what comes to mind? What do we feel? What do we think? We spent about 10 minutes getting to know one another and sharing in small groups. And then we put together a word cloud of these associations. So I'm going to share the screen to what we covered. So in the 9:30 session, these are some of those associations and images that come to mind. We have things like river, confusion, strange numbers, surprise, metaphors, frightening imagery, also some answers and some hope, no more tears, secret code, and then we also have monsters and fire and swords and a three-headed something, 7 churches, horses of the apocalypse, and rapture. That this was a very abstract thing. But then we also have these images of a tree, of a river, like I said before. And then in the evening session, we had a little bit less, but we had John, the author. Rome was mentioned, a lot of numbers, again, a lot of confusion and symbolism, some prediction, some fear, some imagery, some crazy looking angels, future, end times, apocalypse. So after this, we moved into what we could expect from this session. So we started here, and then we moved to first learning about the world behind the text. What is the world like when this book was being written? And then we would read and reflect on Revelation 21 and 22, and then also planned what to expect in the upcoming sessions. So the world behind the text, like I said, is the world around John of Patmos, who was writing this book in about 100 AD, around then. So what was the world like then? What kind of community is John coming out of? And what are the concerns of that community? The world of the text is its own thing. The rich imagery, the vivid metaphors and adjectives that are used to describe really hopeful scenes and also really harrowing and scary scenes. And then what's the world in front of the text? That's our world. When the text lays out in front of you on a table, there's a world in front of it, which is you and I and all of us. So that's something we'll cover and think more about in upcoming sessions. Really, today is about understanding the world behind the text and how it informs the world of the text. And so to get a sense of the world behind the text, we start by looking at what is going on both in Jerusalem and in the Christian world, and also what's going on in the Roman Empire, under which the whole Jewish and Christian world was subject. So I have 2 timelines here. The one on the bottom is just a zoomed in version of this last section. You see these lines that are kind of a little shoot that point to these years about 55 AD to about 100 AD. But before that, we'll look at the top timeline first. And on the bottom side of the top timeline, we have things about Jerusalem, Judea, and Christianity. And on the top side of the thick white line that has all of the numbers of years, we have Roman emperors and kind of what was going on. So the Roman Republic ended around, what is that, 27 AD? Or no, 27 BCE. The ending of the Roman Republic involved Julius Caesar claiming absolute power, and then several years of civil war after that, and a lot of turmoil. Before all of that, though, Judea fell to Pompey. It had been part of the Hasmonean Empire, and then Pompey was a Roman general who conquered and annexed this territory. And when Rome would do that, they would set up a governor in charge of a specific area, typically someone who is of that community, who understands the people and the culture, and who can maintain a sense of peace. Herod the Great was one of those, and he was the Roman governor of Jerusalem from, looks like, around 48 BC till about 4 or 6 BC, which is also when Jesus was born, and it's around the time that we hear about a census being taken. And that's when Mary, Joseph, and Jesus all flee to Egypt, right? The date there is a bit contested, but just know that Herod was the governor of Jerusalem during the time that Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 CE at the Ides of March. And then following that time, a lot of civil war and just kind of chaos in Rome. Caesar Augustus, or Emperor Augustus, becomes the first emperor of the Roman Empire. The style of government changes to an emperorship or a dictatorship, and Augustus is the first. Lasts a long time, and Jesus is born and lives through about the last half of Caesar Augustus's reign. Caesar Tiberius, or Emperor Tiberius, then follows Augustus. Jesus dies during this time. Also during this time, the rulership of the territory of Judea and Jerusalem changes from a governorship to a prefectship. It's just an easier way for them to manage Judea, I guess. So I labeled Pontius Pilate here as prefect of Jerusalem for a short period of time during Caesar Tiberius's reign. And then Caligula follows. Caligula has a very short reign. Claudius follows. Claudius a little bit longer. And then Nero follows. And now we can switch down to the bottom timeline here. So during the time of the end of Tiberius's reign through Caligula and Claudius, Paul starts his ministry. And we see this here in the bottom timeline. Paul's ministry goes until about the Great Fire of Rome. Rome experienced a great fire, the city of Rome, where over half of the city burned to the ground. There were 14 districts in the city, 10 of them burned to the ground, and Christians and Jewish people lived in the areas that didn't burn down. So while Nero was catching heat for the city burning on his watch, in order to sort of cast the blame away from him, and as a sort of it suggested that as a scapegoating measure, Nero pointed the finger at Christians and Jews, and this began the Great Neronian persecution. Under the Emperor Nero, many Christians were martyred. So after this great fire and before the end of Emperor Nero's reign, this is around the time that Peter and Paul both are said to be martyred or killed. Nero dies in 68 AD, and this begins the Year of the Four Emperors, which is just a really tumultuous time. Short-lived emperors, assassinations happening, and sides being taken between Roman generals. And Vespasian is the fourth of the four emperors, and he steps in with a lot of military might and victory behind him, which really marks the ways in which the Roman Empire celebrated victory as a sign of divine rule in a way. During this time, there's this first Judean revolt on the bottom side of this timeline. In Judea, there were already a lot of different kinds of people and a lot of different differences between everyone. And so just regular civic life was already kind of a mess. And as a part of that, there was just general revolt that sparked, and it became a revolt against Rome. Rome comes in and tries to quell it, and it just erupts. Vespasian comes in with his son, Titus, and Titus lays siege to Jerusalem, destroying the temple in 70 AD. This involves Emperor Titus going in, looting the temple, and bringing the spoils of war back to Jerusalem, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So not only is there chaos happening back in Rome, there's also chaos happening in Jerusalem, and we're coming out of a time where a lot of Christians are being persecuted more actively. Fast forward then to the years 81 and on. Domitian becomes the Caesar, or becomes the emperor, and reigns for a long time until the year 96. The year 96 also happens to be when scholars believe the book of Revelation was written. There's not great documentation about who John was, but because of the differences in the way that the Greek was written between the Gospel of John, the letters of John, and the Revelation of John, it's suggested that the authors are different. Although this image of the lamb and Jesus as a shepherd is prevalent in both Revelation and in the Gospel of John. Also in both, Jesus really has a lot of power and knowledge, divine knowledge. So it could be that these books were all written for similar communities, or communities that shared a theological language, but that the authors themselves are probably different. So this is a general overview of kind of some of the timeline. Nero and Domitian are both read because under these two emperors, Christians experienced the most persecution. There were the most martyrdoms, which involved Christians being singled out and identified and asked to pledge their allegiance to Rome, which meant confessing that Caesar is Lord rather than Jesus. And this all has to do, also, it has connections with emperor worship, or the imperial cult. The Arch of Titus is a great visual and a way of understanding this imperial cult. If you've been to the city of Rome, and if you've been to the Colosseum, you may have seen the Arch of Titus in person. It's very close to the Colosseum, as you can see in the top right-hand image here. And we'll watch a quick video about the importance of what this Arch of Titus signifies here. Real quick, I think I need to share my screen with sound. I just realized that. So let's go back here. Okay, we're gonna have to do a couple things. Bear with me. Share screen, Keynote, share. And we're gonna go back here. And we're gonna play. Oh wait, did I do it right? No, I didn't. One moment. Share sound. Click share. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Oh my goodness. All right, here's the video.
looking at the bas-reliefs of the Arch of Titus, the most famous of which show the spoils of Jerusalem being brought into Rome in the great triumphal parade honoring the general, soon-to-be Emperor Titus at his great victory at destroying Jerusalem.
A triumphal arch is something through which the emperor would enter with booty, with lots of attendants and soldiers and prisoners of war. I mean, this was a big moment of celebrating victory in Rome.
At the end of which the general of the losing army would be ceremonially murdered.
Did that happen at this?
Yes, a guy named Simon, son of Giora, who was one of the rebels of Jerusalem, was killed at the end.
In art history, when we look at the Arch of Titus relief, we sometimes miss the violence, and we tend to talk about it formally because in so many ways it exemplifies ancient Roman art. The figures are naturalistic. There's even an illusion of space as these soldiers carry the booty from the temple in Jerusalem through a gate of the city.
Well, we're very fortunate that the Jewish war had its historian. Joseph, son of Mattathias in Hebrew, Flavius Josephus in Latin. He was a Judean general who switched sides in the middle of the war and was supported by the emperor's family to write the history to convince Jews to not be part of this war and to convince Romans that only a small part of the Jewish people were revolting against Rome. And so Josephus is standing at the moment of this triumphal parade, watching it with ultimate perplexity, I think, not knowing which side he was on. And so what we see here is the unique situation where a Roman triumphal parade is responded to by someone who understands the triumph and suffers the triumph at the same time. Josephus.
The Roman Empire is growing in the first century, and the Romans are moving into what we would call the Middle East and the province of Judea. Judea becomes absorbed into the Roman Empire.
Judea has polytheists and has Samaritans, people whose holy mountain is in what's now Nablus, and lots of Jews. And the Jews and the Samaritans are not so happy about these pagans coming into their country and taking over their holy land. And the complexities of interaction boiled in such complex ways. And so we're watching a culture figuring out what it means to work with this very peculiar group with its one temple for the one God.
And that one temple is in Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem.
In that temple are holy objects.
Where most peoples would have a different temple in each city. So there'd be a temple for my God here, and I go to another city, there'd be another God. Jews only had one. And so they had special rights, for example, in the Roman Empire to send back their donations from wherever they lived to Jerusalem, where other people weren't allowed to send money across international lines. The Romans worked to find a way to take these people who had the potential of being good subjects, but had certain odd needs. They had their temple, and they insisted upon circumcising their children, and they had food laws, and they had a thing called a Sabbath. And all of these were very weird to Romans in different ways. They weren't all unique to Jews. So, for example, Egyptians would circumcise as well, but many of them were strange. And Judeans were so apparent because they had a religion of books, and people could read them. And so the complex problem led, for example, to the building of the temple in Jerusalem that by all intents and purposes looks like a Roman temple of the age of Augustus, but has something odd about it, and that is it has no statues, no images of deities, which Romans would say, oh, that's a Roman temple without the fun stuff, without the things that are meaningful, and Jews would say, this is the Jerusalem temple, no images here.
But there were things in the temple, there were holy objects, and that's what we see here being carried into Rome as spoils in the Arch of Titus. So we have the menorah, a very important symbol in Jewish history, especially in the Roman period. But we see other holy objects that were in the temple, like the show table.
Table for the showbread, or the table for the bread of the face of God. This bread that the Pentateuch, that the Torah says, should be set before God and 12 breads placed upon it and continued to be used. Not the same table, but replacement tables, until we come to the one that's illustrated on the arch, which is a typical Roman table where non-Jews would have put the images of their divinities Jews put their holy objects that served the divinity. But when the Romans came and took Judea, the last of the Jewish kings, a fellow named Mattathias Antigonus, minted a coin, and on one side there was a menorah, and the other side was the table.
After a long and terrible war with the Jews fighting against the Roman occupation, we have the most holy objects taken from the most holy place, shown as pure booty.
The cool thing is that you could leave the Arch of Titus, walk under it, go 100 or so yards, and enter into a temple built by the Emperor Vespasian, Titus's father, where the greatest art of the age had been collected in a way to claim the greatness of Rome and of Vespasian. And on one of the pedestals, see the self-same lampstand and the same table and the same horns. And so it was possible to go back and forth between the real objects described in Josephus's text and shown in the arch, and then into this ancient museum, but not a museum like our museums, a museum of war booty and of trophies collected by a man who was about to become a god himself. So it's a deeply meaningful procession for Romans, but for Jews it must have been ghastly.
So that last bit that he just said, war booty collected by a man who was about to become a god himself. That's a really important phrase that explains this idea of emperor worship that plays into the general chaos of this time and era that we're talking about. This image that you see on the screen is the Emperor Titus on the back of an eagle with wings that come out of the eagle, right? So Titus is riding this eagle up to heaven. And if you are standing at the physical Arch of Titus and you look straight up, I think this is where it's at. I haven't been there personally. But if you look straight up, you'll see this relief etched into the ceiling of the arch. It's depicting this word here that's Greek, apotheosis. Theo is a root word meaning God, and this apotheosis means a sort of becoming God and ascending into godhood. So Titus is becoming a god himself on the back of this eagle as a sort of not a gift, but as a result, a consequence, but a good consequence of him being militarily victorious, of him winning battles. This is his, the words on the tip of my tongue, reward. This is a reward of sorts. So in this imperial cult worship, or this worship of emperors, there was an expectation that whenever you participated in any sort of Roman activity, whether it meant like stadium entertainment or going to any sort of like entertainment event in general, sporting event, that all of these had connections to Roman gods and worship of Roman gods, which included then the emperors themselves. As they ascended into the positions of gods, they became part of the worship. And that also meant that while they were alive, they were to be revered as gods. Christians did not like this, especially since they were often the ones being persecuted since the time of Nero. They were the ones that were being brought into the stadiums and burned at the stake. Wild beasts were being set loose on them, so they were being attacked by lions and bears and leopards and all sorts of those. And they were being asked to confess that Caesar is Lord rather than Jesus. So with all of that in mind, then as a group, we read this. Oh, I need to share the screen again. We read Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, For the first heaven and first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. God will dwell with them. They will be God's peoples, and God himself will be with them and be their God. God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new. Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." Then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty, I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life. Those who conquer will inherit these things, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the polluted, the murderers, the sexually immoral, the sorcerers, the idolaters, and all liars, their place will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is their second death." So in this, we have God will be with them and will be their God. God will wipe their tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. This is a kind of message that I can imagine the people of this time, the Christians of this time, really could use to hear. Like I said earlier, John of Patmos is probably not the same John that wrote the Gospel of John, but rather an elder who was exiled to this island of Patmos for his messages, for likely his refusal to say things like Caesar is Lord. The island of Patmos was an island for political prisoners. It was far away, but it was still off the coast of Turkey. So Turkey is where all of this is going on. What is now modern day Turkey. And I'm going to share a map to show where we are here in Geneva, which I'm actually not there now, but as we zoom out, you'll see where I am. I'm in Hyde Park currently. But then we move from America over to Europe and over to Turkey. This was called Asia Minor at the time and still is. And then the areas that we're talking about are this western coast of Turkey, very close to Greece. Athens is over here. And then this section is where we're talking about. So Ephesus, the city of Ephesus, is over here in this little area. And Patmos is an island that's located right here. This is Patmos, which nowadays there's lots of boats going around Patmos. But at the time, there were not as many, I'm guessing. And another helpful image, now that we kind of know where we are, is this. So John writes to the 7 churches from Patmos, which is down here. And then this is Turkey. So here's Istanbul, up between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. And these cities that have little green circles around them are all of the cities that are named, or the churches that are named, that John of Patmos is writing to. This is a vision. This book is a vision that is being written to these churches and is also, obviously, from what the passage we just read, designed to sort of strengthen and encourage. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying will be no more. This is one of the key tools that we have to understand the book of Revelation today. What was going on in the world at the time? A lot of martyrdom, a lot of chaos, and that brings a lot of grief, a lot of fear, a lot of trauma. And today, when we look at the book of Revelation, without that in mind, we can get hung up on a lot of other things. So as we are looking for resources to help understand the book of Revelation, keeping in mind the historical context is really important, and also understanding the kind of literature the book of Revelation is. The book of Revelation is doing 3 different things. First, it's a letter to these 7 churches. Second, it's a piece of apocalyptic literature, which is its own genre of literature in the ancient world. The book of Daniel has some apocalyptic literature. Another example of the apocalyptic style of literature is The Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. You have a character, a main character, who is living in such a way that isn't good, and this character goes through a set of visions where this character is guided through visions, detailing sort of the natural consequences or what is to come if things don't change. And so in the Christmas story, you have the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas future, which inspires Scrooge to change his ways, right? That's the apocalyptic style of literature. And this book is also a piece of biblical prophecy. Biblical prophecy is different than the way that prophecy is used today, thanks to sort of fantasy movies and science fiction-y things. Prophecy today is imagined to be future telling or fortune telling. It's like an inevitable thing, it's fate, it's what's going to happen. But biblical prophecy isn't the same. Biblical prophecy is a critique of the community as it is from someone who has received a revelation from God, and that it, again, in critiquing the way that society is, it is telling people to change. And if that change happens, God shows up differently. So the book of Jonah is a great example of a prophecy that's given to Jonah. Jonah goes and tells the prophecy, and then the people change, and God changes God's mind and doesn't bring destruction to Nineveh. So if you are finding resources that are telling this is inevitable, this is what's happening, here is sort of a script for how this is going to play out, those resources are not taking into account the kinds of styles that this book is being written in, and it's also not taking into account the historical context and the original receivers of this word, of this message. With that, one final piece, and then I'm going to invite you to do what we did with the rest of our time, and also update you on what next week will look like. The final piece, though, is that the imagery of the book of Revelation isn't so much an image of a far away place that will come, or that we will get sucked away to, that we're going to get evacuated and beamed up out of this world and go to a faraway place. Rather, the imagery of the book of Revelation is an invitation to see our world in a deeper way. Imagine the Chronicles of Narnia. The main characters of the Chronicles of Narnia, the four siblings, don't evacuate this world. Rather, they go into a wardrobe and see a whole new world. And in the last battle, the one of the books, the characters are not in a different world at all. They see their own hometown, the hills that they grew up in, but the color blue is bluer and the grass is greener and everything seems more like the real thing. This is the kind of imagery that we're invited into in the book of Revelation, the world of the text. The imagery is vivid, but it's describing the world as it was in the time, and the ways that that world kind of recirculates and gurgles back up again in every time and place. So we think about the images that we're going to see next week as we read more of the book of Revelation, not as a predictive and inevitable thing that will come, but rather as a way of describing the powers of the world at that time that resonate with us in our time as well, but that it's an invitation to step into a more vivid vision with what we will read next in this session as a key to understanding the book of Revelation. So I'm going to switch back to where we are. This is what we did next in this session. I don't need to share sound anymore. Share. Here we go. So next in the session we did, this is Revelation 21 verses 9 through 27. And this is the vision of the New Jerusalem. Thinking about the imagery of Revelation as an invitation to see our current world in a deeper way. I'd like you to read this section of the book of Revelation. The imagery is vivid. A question you may have is, how can a city be made of gold but also be clear as glass? How does that make sense? It might not make sense in the way that we understand it, but it certainly gives a new flavor to the way you might imagine this city, right? After this section, we moved on to read Revelation 22, and noticed the images here: a river, a tree of life, where the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. And this river and tree is a callback to Genesis 2, one of our creation narratives, where after God made Adam, God planted all sorts of trees in the garden, and the tree of life was planted there. And also there were rivers going through Eden. And one of those rivers went around all sorts of gold and onyx and bdellium, which are all gemstones, which we've heard a lot about all the sorts of gemstones in the previous chapter. So the connections that are being made here in the end of Revelation to the very beginning of our Bible really tie everything into a full circle. I use the Bible Gateway app, or the website Bible Gateway, which you can select your translation on the right-hand side. It's BibleGateway.org, I believe. You can see it on the top. And in this little page options button, I can click on cross references here. And then when I scroll to the bottom, or even within the text, I can click at different cross references. But if I scroll to the bottom, I can see all the things that are being mentioned, all the biblical connections across these two chapters and across the whole book of Revelation. But if you notice, a lot of them are prophets. And especially in the previous chapter, many of the connections were prophets, which again signals that this book is in the style of biblical prophecy. So go ahead and read Revelation 22 on your own. And before the next session, with these frames in mind, with understanding more about the Roman Empire and with understanding the imagery as an invitation into our world rather than away from our world, read through the whole book of Revelation and see if you notice anything different. There's going to be a lot of questions, I'm sure, but in our next session, we'll cover Revelation 12 through 20. And in our third, we'll cover Revelation 5 through 11. And then in our final session, we'll cover Revelation 1 through 5. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.